Hey guys, it's Alexander Williamson with The Secret History Living in Your Aquariums. So, today we're going to talk about an incredible woman. That's right, woman naturalist from early in marine biology and aquarium history. In fact, many people would argue that she is the creator, the inventor, and the prototypical marine biologist, ecologist, and also ichthyologist. This woman, Jeanne Villapreux-Powers, is one of the most incredible women that you may have never heard of. And the reason that you may not have heard of her is because of an extremely unfortunate and just bizarre bad luck incident that really deprived the world of a lot of information that could have set the hobby, the science of aquariums, of marine biology, and of ecology back a good 60 years. So let's get into it and talk about who this woman was, how her work was destroyed, and what happened afterwards. So in the year 1794, this woman was born in Gillion, France, and she was born to a poor shoemaker. She learned how to sew and mend clothing as a teenager and a child, and worked because she was from a poor family and lived in a village in the suburbs of a larger city. And at the age of 17, supposedly she walked barefoot because her sister needed her other pair of shoes to go to school. So she didn't have them and was done with school by 16. And so while she was working from home, she walked barefoot into Paris looking for opportunities to make money, bring back to her family, and so forth. Well, she makes it to Paris, and apparently she was a striking woman, both, aesthetically and intellectually. And soon she fell in with somebody who was a friend of an Italian princess. And she made a beautiful dress for this princess for a coronation ceremony. And then later another bridal dress, and then later she kind of became, by the age of 19, so within 2 years, she worked her way up into that social class right during the French Revolution. I mean, during a time when it was dangerous to associate with royals, yet the Enlightenment was in full gear, and science and academia they were looked at as the future. They were looked at as the new upper class. Knowledge would supplant dynasties, and she was able to walk between both worlds. And this woman married a rich merchant that was friends with the royal family, and his name was James Powell. So that's how she got the name Villapreux-Powers. Now, Villepul was her maiden name, and she unusually kept that as a woman back then. Jeanne was her first name, and she kept the hyphenated name, which is pretty unusual. So she married this man, and he was a very progressive for the time man, and they moved to Sicily, the southern island of Italy, in 1816. And so if you're doing the math in your head, she would be somewhere, 24 years old or so when they moved there. And for the next 20 years, she studied the marine life and the ecosystem of the island. Now, there was a craze kind of sweeping England and France, Germany, the Americas also, for the upper class to collect things at the beach and bring them home and put them in tubs or fountains. But at this time, there was not the aquariums we think of yet. And it was her that is credited with inventing I mean, it wasn't enough for her to invent one aquarium. She invented 3 aquariums that we know well now today. And the first one was an all-glass aquarium where she could bring home, mostly marine specimens and watch them develop in their natural habitat. She would take live rock from the beach and coral and seaweed and any sort of whatever vegetation and sediment and substrate that was local to the area. She would take that home and replicate it in these glass boxes. Now, glass was expensive back then, so it was fortunate that she was married to an upper class merchant, basically. And he was gone a lot of the time. He bought and sold goods all over the Mediterranean, and he started bringing back samples for her. And many of the samples were of beautiful ornate shells. And so these ornate shells and things that he would bring her, one of which was the nautilus, and she fell in love with this species, and the golden ratio being a part of the shell. And this is during a time when the classic Greek and Roman ideas of beauty and intelligence, democracy, that Enlightenment energy basically harken back to those old studies of the classics, as they say in Western society. And she fell in love with those. And so the argument at the time amongst most men at the Zoological Society in London, which at the time there was not a difference between marine biology and zoology, or really biology, period, other than anatomy, which was human. So she basically said, you know what, we can't just study dead specimens in a jar. That doesn't make sense. We can't see how they grow. We can't see how they develop. How could we ever know where they came from if we can't see their growth stages? And she was reading works of people like Charles Darwin and Richard Owens, and in their work, she had some things that she actually kind of thought were debatable that later on were kinks that needed to be worked out. Now, this was before Origin of Species was published or anything, and a while before. But she was reading these works. She taught herself to read and speak probably about 5 different languages, it said. And she just really became a woman of extreme culture and education. And she wrote while she lived in Sicily, which in a way, you may think of Sicily, the island, as a little bit remote. And back then, in a way, it was. But also, back then, there weren't cars, there weren't planes, but there were boats. So the world was connected by water a lot more. So her living in a port city, she could actually put specimens or receive specimens on these merchant ships and on these trade ships and put letters to other scientists from all over Europe. Boats made it all the way into Paris and into Germany, up the rivers, and then anywhere that's on the coast, of course, also received these boats. And Jeanne Villapreux-Powers, she was an incredible woman in that she bucked the tradition of what the men wanted to look at. And they were obsessed with, people like Carl Linnaeus, who basically is the father of taxonomy. They were obsessed with categorizing animals. And basically, the nation that did it, or the person it got named after, a lot of that carried a lot of importance. And especially as the 1840s and 50s came into power, this sort of early nationalism amongst the states in Europe, the countries in Europe, developed. And so it was important for the Brits to say that they had, the best scientists, and Scotland to say it had the best scientists, and France, so on and so forth. And she broke out of this mold of kind of sticking a flag in it and claiming it's yours. And she said, what we need to do is look at things and figure out what it is we need to know. Don't go into it with just a question, but let's just sit and watch the entire life cycle of these species. So at the time, all the men in marine biology, which was not a thing yet, it was a correspondence through the zoological societies of Europe and the United States, and they thought that shells on nautilus, on many shellfish, were made by some sort of snail, then dropped, and then picked up by cephalopods and other creatures that have a more rigid frame. So same with the cuttlefish, it's got this cuttle bone in it. And so they thought that perhaps it formed around this. And she was able, with her aquarium system, to observe the larval napoli of the teeny tiny, when the eggs get made and it's just plankton floating in the water, she could watch them develop in the house under a microscope, under a lens, and was able to, or magnifying glass, and was able to conclusively show with illustrations, she was a fabulous artist too, that in fact these actually grew a shell, and that animals could grow shells. They weren't some magical property of snails only, or other insects and things, that they grew the shell in a process, and she was able to show how they grew even, and where the growth plates were, and then find other species that were slightly different and find links. And so she started identifying species based on their physical structures and their behavior and their ecosystems and their diets, more than just examining the anatomy of something in a jar that's been pickled and sent back from some colony or faraway territory of a European country. So moving on from there, she began to give nature tours of Sicily, and she published a really renowned and still kind of the definitive guide to nature in Sicily, which was the Guida per la Sicilia, and that was in 1832 that she wrote it, and it was essentially a series of essays on all the different species that she witnessed, and then she would give tours of visiting dignitaries and intellectuals. In 1842, this is one of her few pieces of published work. It's a series of journals, and it went into print in London in both French and English. There was a limited number made, and it was really for scholars to reference. Her biggest work, which was 40 years, so another 20 years after her coming out with this kind of assessing the ecosystem of what was right there, she came up with ideas like watching octopus and learning that the male octopus, when impregnating the female octopus, would actually lose its arm with the clutch of eggs on it, with the fertilizing agent on it, and that would then be enveloped and become part of the female octopus in the specific species that she was studying. And it was things like these that you just would miss if you weren't part of watching the food chain, essentially, watching what they eat, watching how they behave. She even documented and changed forever the definition. Charles Darwin, people were saying, well, what divides us from the beasts, from the animals? And there were philosophers that said, oh, it's art, it's tool making, it's emotion, it's burying the dead, it's caring for your young. Whatever aspect they wanted to go with, there was this huge debate because Darwin's work had kind of upset that. And she said, octopus do use tools. They use rocks to pry open shells. And in fact, she documented that in her book Argonauta Argos. And she showed that these octopus were able to take a sharp rock, wedge it into the shell, then wrap their arm around it and use it as a lever or a pry, and then open it, and then with their beak eat it. She also showed that, the octopus was willing to die for its young, guarding its garden or its eggs, its cave. And you may be wondering, okay, so how did she figure that out in an aquarium? Today we even have a hard time figuring that out. She's got to balance the nitrites, the nitrates, things like that. She's got to, figure out the salinity and not let ammonia build up, all these things, and feed the animals. Well, she was a strict nature observer, and she copied nature. She knew that she needed to go get new water every day, so she went and got new water every day. Water change every day, 100% or 80%, whatever it was. And a lot of the techniques we use now, when she was studying the freshwater Sicilian species, she actually just brought in dirt, soil, and layered it in substrate, just like she found in the creek beds and things, just like she notated it being in the wild. And later, people like Diane Wallstead, really did scientific work on this and figured it out. But at the time, she was so well respected, she was worried her work wouldn't be received well being a woman outside of France. There had been the French Revolution, and so it was a little more open at that point for women to be of equal footing of men. Of course, that's a silly thing to say in retrospect, but at the time, the idea of a humanist outlook that men and women were both capable of science, philosophy, intelligence, these sort of things, was present in some of France's circles of the elite. And, in France at large also. Well, these ideas kind of spread throughout the Enlightenment, towards the end of the Enlightenment and into the Industrial Revolution. And it was really not until the Industrial Revolution started really cracking down on the amount of time people had, putting them back in textile factories and putting them into working terrible conditions, long hours, that women had to leave the home. And so a lot of these upper class women of the era were able to spend their time at home. If they had children, they would bring their children along. They had to do the second shift, as it's called in classical feminism. You work the day job and then you work the job at home. Well, the upper class didn't have to work the day job. They didn't have to care for the kids at home even sometimes because of maids. But by all accounts, she did take care of her own children and was very fond of the two she had. But beyond all that, she submitted her work through her husband's name first, who was just a merchant. He wasn't accredited with anything. He hadn't studied at any university. Well, neither had she. And she was worried that since she was a woman, that it wouldn't be taken seriously. So she submitted it as Jeanne. Well, soon she claimed credit for this work when it was widely said that it was an amazing piece of work. These first two things. First, the nautilus shell papers, and then the octopus behavior, and then later on the whole compendium of work of all cephalopods and mollusks and snails and sea cucumbers and all sorts of things that she studied. In letters, we're going back mostly to England, to London at the time, which was kind of the center for keeping the records for the most part. The Swiss, the French, the Germans, and the Dutch also had large universities that were also doing this work, but London tended to be kind of the center of the world's discourse and universities of highest acclaim at the time, Oxford and Cambridge, things like that. So after all this hard work and she starts getting accreditation and everything, She becomes a member of over a dozen scientific societies in different cultures, using her ability to speak different languages to correspond with other scientists, and both backing up other claims from other scientists who started using her methods. She actually invented, along with the glass aquarium, the aquarium that is kind of the exhibit aquarium, that's metal on 4 sides, or the bottom and 3 sides, however you want to look at it, and then glass on only 1 side, so that it can be very strong. Back then, panes of glass weren't made the same way, and so getting a big strong pane of glass was hard to hold back that water. But with this, she was able to get into the hundreds of gallons and study things like an octopus den, cross section in her own yard or in her own house in Sicily. And the last thing she developed, which was used and is still used, Jacques Cousteau, all sorts of people have used variations of this, and now we use submersibles and video cameras to do this. But she used what existed as a diving bell back then in order to literally, they would place a observation bell underwater, maybe 12 feet underwater, so it still had light and things, but they'd place that on a reef or in the rocks, and you could go under there, and they had billows that were hand cranked to get air into there, but you could swim down under it, they'd get under the bell, and then you had a section of air and these glasses that you could look through. And that was another method of studying fish and sea creatures actually underwater for their whole life cycle, every day going there, just crazy commitment and dedication. Well, through all this time, she starts compiling all this work, and she has, by what all accounts, was somewhere between 700 and 900 illustrations, as well as over 2,000 handwritten pages of work. And she's going to publish this life's work, and a lot of it had never been seen. It had not been put up for scientific review, scholarly review yet. And she got on a ship with her husband in the year 1843. And unfortunately, that ship sank halfway on the journey from Sicily to London, where she was moving so she could be one of the head intellectuals in the world, based at the zoology department in London. And the ship sank, her specimens sank, her drawings sank, her personal goods sank, her husband's gold sank, their furniture sank. It was close to ruinous for them. And because of this, the work was never published. However, her letters were published, and there are about 5 essays that still exist and were, pivotal works in the hobby, as well as her idea of sending blueprints, ideas, and the importance of why we need to study an ecosystem and not a specimen in one jar that's dead and, losing color and pale and in formaldehyde or whatnot. And obviously the aquarium, the biggest thing of all. And she doesn't get credit for it. Now, a lot of people say it's because of this shipwreck. And it's true that she went into a deep depression after this shipwreck. And even though that happened in 1843, she never emotionally recovered. And in 1871 was the year that she passed away. So for the rest of her years, as she got older, into her 70s, 60s and 70s, she never got back into it. She did keep pets. She was an interesting lady, as I'm sure you could guess, and she was fond of Leonardo da Vinci's work, and because of that, she had, just like the famous painting of the woman with the martens or the mink ferret type creatures, she had 2 pet beach martens that would wrap around her neck. They look like ferrets today. but she had them as pets. So she sounds like a fascinating lady, very interesting. She stayed married to her husband, and by all accounts, she really did love him. And it's just an incredible story of a woman 100 years ahead of her time, you know, in science and socially with what she did with social norms. And so I want to hear in the comments from you guys what you think. Do you think that it's really because of the shipwreck that we don't hear about her? Or do you think it's because at the time she was one of a very, very few females who dare step into the all-male world of scholarly learning at the time? Something to think about. The voices we hear or don't hear, and the methods we use or don't use, and how long we can be set back because of a prejudice or because of a random fluke accident, you know, whichever it may be that you think, or a little of both. Think of all the things throughout history that probably unfolded that way, and how our hobby could have been different if we had 60 more years, essentially, of work and reflection done. I mean, some of her studies that were found in correspondence letters in the 1990s were information that they later looked up and did studies on in 1997, and were able to actually prove what her hypotheses were in these letters. And it was information that was new to science even at the turn of the millennium. 200 years after she left, essentially. 185 years after she left being a seamstress in Paris, so as a teenage girl. So if you guys enjoy this content, please give it a thumbs up, a like, leave a comment, other names that you'd like me to talk about in the field of ichthyology, marine biology, science, whatever it may be, secret history that goes on in our hobby that we may not know about. And also what you think of. Do you think it was because she was a woman that she was kind of held back and not well known? Or do you think it was just the unfortunate news of the shipwreck? There's been a lot of shipwrecks of important people, and seems like they get their things together a lot of times. So, makes me wonder. But she's getting the credit she deserves today on our channel, and with you listening to this. And also, she got the credit again when she officially had a Mars crater named after her. The Villepul-Powers crater on Mars was named after her. So, kind of cool that she's got a reach now that goes all the way to Mars, you know. You thought from Sicily to London was a big reach? Try going to Mars, you know. So, who knows, maybe we'll hear more about Viillepreux-Powers in the future as we travel and explore Mars. Interestingly enough, one of my sources for this is Helen Scales, and she wrote a book called Spirals in Time about the study of snails and spiral shells and spirals in nature in general too. And she talks a lot about Jeanne Villapreux-Powers, and she did a lot of research that's great. I was able to go to her sources and look at other sources. So I did an old video about this in the past that was shorter, but I wanted to do it a little more justice now that it's a bigger channel and only a few hundred people ever saw that video. So the cool thing about that book, Spirals in Time, is you can get it on Amazon Kindle. You can order it from Amazon. I'll put a link below to that. And also, if you want to join the channel to support videos like this that take a lot of time to research, so I can do it full time, even just being a $1.99 member helps, or dropping a super chat, or Patreon. There's a list of things you can do to support the channel below if you like this content. And also, there's a link to a free trial of 30 days at Audible, one of our sponsors today. And there are many books about fish and marine biology and science. And Spirals in Time is one that will be available on Audible very shortly, I'm told. When I looked it up online, it's supposed to be coming out in the next 6 months. But until then, you can also highlight it on Kindle and have it read back to you on the newer software if you need to do that. But there's many great books. Dragon Behind the Glass is another incredible book about this woman who was an investigative journalist for the New York Times and other publications, and she looked into the Arowana trade and how seedy and dark and actually deadly it became in the early 2000s in Taiwan and China and New York City and America even too. But it's a great book. That one's it's available for audio book. And just those are a couple suggestions if you do want to do the free trial, which is 30 days free, and you get 2 free books. Doing so will help me. It'll give me a couple bucks towards the channel just for signing up for the free trial. And if you decide to keep it, then it actually doubles that amount, and I think I get $5 for the channel. So if you want to support the channel but you don't have the money, that's a good way to do it, and you get free books you get to keep forever on a device to listen to them, your phone, laptop, tablet, whatever it may be, and it's just a way to support the channel. So thank you so much for listening and hearing this story. If you know more about her, leave that in the comments as well. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.